Welcome to Noble Innovation, where we delve into the inspiring stories of remarkable individuals whose impact has changed the world for the better. Noble Innovation is a play on words for the Nobel Prize because we began this series with those who've been honored by the Nobel Prize. Join us as we uncover the biographies and remarkable achievements of those trailblazers driven by their noble desire to improve humanity for the better. We'll dive into the lives of the Nobel laureates, breaking into their groundbreaking contributions, discover the motivations and passions that led these innovators to create lasting positive impact, and also I'll bring on experts for different subject areas so that we don't have to water down any of the content of the great contributions or achievements of these great innovators. So if you are a curious mind or you're eager to learn from the accomplishments of great visionaries, this is who this is meant for. Hopefully that I can help provide some inspiration that I found by learning about some of these experts that have gone on to do some great things. So I'll begin with a little excerpt and then get into the 1920 Nobel Prize on August Krogh for his discovery of the capillary motor regulating mechanism. So we'll find out what that means. So when I was younger, we used to go to Ocean City, Maryland, and we'd go to the beach and hang out there for some time. And after lounging around in the hot sun, we thought, okay, let's go into the water and cool off. And you sort of inch in there slowly as if, you're going to avoid the inevitable shivering that happened. It turns out just diving in head first was the better way to do it anyway. But then once we wanted to warm up, we'd swim up and down the coastline, pretty much like 100 feet down the road that the waves would push you in that diagonal direction and you wonder where you ended up at the beach anyway. But the more you swim, the warmer you'd get. And, if you get out of the water and you rush over and you pick up your camera, the best time to get a picture is as soon as you get out of the water because your shoulders and your pecs actually look massive. The reason we understand that the fact that when we increase our energy demands, that's what determines muscle blood flow and oxygen delivery to muscle. And this can be explained because of August Krogh's discoveries. Due to his sophisticated technological advances in blood oxygen content, in a series of experiments, we have a better understanding of our circulatory system's crucial role in getting oxygen to the muscles. And not only did this spawn the molecular basis of the field of exercise physiology, but is also the basis of numerous tools used in hospitals today, particularly related to gas analysis, such as those used during anesthesia or in the ICU. So I'll now begin with his early life. He was born in November 1874 in Denmark as the oldest of 6 siblings on a farm that his family had settled into almost 300 years earlier. And his father was a brewer, but was trained as a shipbuilder. And his mother taught him to read and write by the age 5, and then he went off to school at age 6, which he says that he doesn't like very much. After age 6, he went to a small secondary school, but he thinks that the school did not markedly influence his development. But outside school, he cultivated his early awakened interest in nature. At an early age, he was interested in animals, and for hours, he would follow the behavior of insects and spiders. By age 12, he was trying chemical and physical experiments he'd read about in a Danish encyclopedia. And there's a component here that I'm really excited about. So some of the first inklings of one of the crucial elements of his identity was that he was crafty and he used limited resources for his experiments. His ability, so for example, he had to content himself with the limited material within his reach in the small country town, and he himself assumed that this fact helped to develop his later remarkable ingenuity in improvising apparatus from the few and primitive things at his disposal. As a rule, Krogh's apparatus was inexpensive, and he maintained his economizing attitude even after large funds had been put under his control. So this right here is, I think, a crucial element, is that this resourcefulness, this ability to build a lot from a little, is something that can really help a lot of innovators in their time. And so I'm interested to see and share with you guys how this actually helped play into his success in the future. I'll go a bit into the beginnings of his research career. He goes on to college. He goes to the University of Copenhagen and is unsure whether or not to go into zoology or physics. And another interesting key moment here was the advice of William Sorensen, who was a zoologist that he used to play with on holidays on the farm in his early years. He was known to be years ahead of his time, and he advised Krogh to attend Christian Bohr's lectures for medical students at Copenhagen. And so fortunately, he followed this advice, and this is the guy that Krogh ended up working for a lot of this time. So the physiologist Christian Bohr never won a Nobel Prize himself, but is the father of Niels Bohr and the grandfather of Og Bohr. Both are Nobel laureates. But Christian himself has some famous scientific findings, which is still used in medical school. We see the oxygen hemoglobin saturation desaturation curve. Essentially, it's a curve that tells you about the offloading of oxygen from hemoglobin. So the way that our body carries oxygen from the air throughout our body is by binding to hemoglobin inside red blood cells. And the affinity to oxygen changes based on the environment of that time. And there's characteristic curves that can tell you whether or not an individual's blood saturation will be impacted by these variables. So this was done in the late 1800s by Christian Bohr, and this is the lab that August Krogh ended up joining when he was just a young undergraduate and medical student. So his time in Bohr's lab is especially noticeable for his training in quantitative work and the testing of theories. So these are two elements that he ascribes were crucial to his time in Bohr's lab. And another thing that became very apparent is his capacity to build new tools. One of his first projects required him to build an apparatus that studied microscopic air bubbles with unprecedented precision. And also he describes his ability to build new tools was really through his capacity for what he calls visual thinking. He was able to see before him the image of an apparatus projected into space. He could preserve this image, improve it, and get it to move. He actually said that when he was drawing, he never drew things out before he started building them. He actually felt limited by seeing the objects on paper. So he actually just worked everything out in his head as he was devising new devices. He actually later, Krogh himself, described this habit of thought, which he assumed to be the background of all of his other abilities. So his eye for detail also came into this. That's how he was able to put a lot of things in his head together. He was always, from an early age, seems like he was studying things early on. But visual thinking and ruminating in his mind, he thinks is one aspect and attribute that set him apart from other colleagues. Another interesting finding in reading from his sources, the great source will be in the show notes. It was published in 1952 in the Yale Journal of Biology and Medicine by another colleague of his. And he talks about his use of dreams for work. Krogh said that his brain worked unconsciously, where he believes he developed and perceived many ideas during sleep. He recalls that he would remember images like plants, animals, and apparatuses very well, but could not well remember faces or book pages. And his inability to not recognize faces makes me wonder how he was at interacting with other individuals. I actually don't, there wasn't a lot of information about that, but I'm wondering if how he acted with other people had anything to do with his really industrious mindset and kind of engineering mindset that he displays. And then finally, I'll go into a little bit of an excerpt of the first instance that really displays kind of putting all together this ingenuity, this creativity, and working on a concept that actually has implications for today, and actually why we need to eat protein rather than just inhaling our protein from the air. So when he was 32 years old in 1906, he was awarded the prize of the Austrian Academy of Sciences for a paper on nitrogen metabolism. And so nitrogen is important for amino acid metabolism. Actually, amino in amino acid is related to the nitrogenous group, so the nitrogen-containing group on the amino acid molecule. So this is like leucine, the branched chain amino acids. Nitrogen is a crucial component of amino acids. And the thought at the time was, because nitrogen is also more than around 75% of our air, so oxygen is 20.93% of air, carbon dioxide less than 0.05% or something like that, and nitrogen is most of the remainder of the air that we breathe. So it was natural to wonder, do we get nitrogen into our amino acids and proteins by breathing it in. This is something that certain plants are able to do, called nitrogen fixation. So just from the atmosphere, plants are able to fix nitrogen and incorporate it into their own amino acids. So what Krogh thought in order to tackle this problem was that how people were even measuring the problems related to this were completely inconsistent with any sort of logical conclusion. So his thought was, okay, let me just build a better tool. He realized that temperature control was actually going to be a crucial component of this, and that's something that all other scientists had ignored at the time. So what he decided is that in order for the temperature to be controlled well enough, the apparatus actually needed to be submerged fully in water. So he made a new small apparatus that was able to be submerged all the way in water, that was able to measure nitrogen content of tiny gas bubbles, and realized that all previous results were inaccurate because of the inability to control temperature. And this result concluded that, including that animals, and thus we human animals, do not fix nitrogen from the atmosphere as some certain plants do. And this is why we need to obtain our nitrogen and thus our amino acids from diet. So this is when he was in his early 30s. So early on, he's realizing that people aren't able to tackle a problem with the right tools. So he comes up with what aspect of the tool he needs to optimize, makes the tool, does the measurement, and then is able to come up with a conclusion that people were puzzled over for a long time. And so this was right before he starts getting into the work that I'll get into now that led to his Nobel Prize. And so I'll give you some background onto where the state of the science is. So in his Nobel Science lecture, you can see what he wrote and what he told the audience. He said that Harvey had demonstrated that blood within an organism was in constant circulation, passing from out of the heart, through the arteries, to all the various organs, and then returning through the veins. And so about 50 years later, Malpighi and Leeuwenhoek discovered that the connection between the smallest branches of the arteries and the veins were actually through another subset of vessels called capillaries. And it's an extremely fine network of capillaries that is only visible by the microscope. So Krogh then says, capillaries have therefore been known for about 250 years, and it had been obvious almost from the first that they were, in one sense, the most important element of the whole circulatory system. All of the exchange between the blood and the organs of nutrient materials and waste products, of oxygen and CO2, takes place in their walls. In them, the blood fulfills its real function. One could say the whole circulatory machine exists for their sake. So you can see how captivated he was by the concept of capillaries, those small vessels that connect arteries and veins within our organs and tissues, and where gas exchange and nutrient exchange actually occurs at the molecular level. So the first discovery that he goes on to make is that gas exchange in the lungs in humans and skeletal muscle as well occurs due to diffusion, so direct transit across capillary membranes between tissues. And so this is different because actually his boss, Bohr, his advisor, thought that lung gas exchange occurred through secretory processes and was regulated by the nervous system. So it's a completely different sort of conceptual framework that requires this sort of thinking. Secretory processes, so things like secreting hormones and whatsoever, is completely different than diffusion. It's just a completely different chemical process. So this is an idea that Krogh had that is really inconsistent with Bohr, who's at this time a world-leading expert and who he's trained under. So he thought, if I'm going to actually go on and prove this, I need to be absolutely sure because I have a lot of respect for my advisor, but this is a fundamental disagreement that he might not be so happy with. So he actually waited several years before he published the 7 papers on the mechanism of gas exchange. And in order to develop these papers, he made a microtonometer and micro gas analysis that could measure gas content of extremely tiny air bubbles, like even those at the smallest alveoli in the lung. So basically, he made a tool that could measure things that nothing else could in order to solve this problem. And in these 7 papers, another extremely interesting thing is that all 7 of these scientific papers were published with his wife as the only other co-author. She was a physician at Copenhagen, and they ended up working together all of their lives. And it was thought that, as she's a physician and Krogh is a PhD, and he never ended up winning. I actually don't know if it's a PhD or an MD. Yeah, it is his PhD. He had a master's and a PhD. That she was able to give the human insight. And so that's a concept that you'll see today, physicians working with scientists in order to make sure that there's some human applicability of some of these basic sciences. So this might have been crucial to some of the applicability to humans. And so as he published these 7 papers, the field was shocked. There were plenty of people that thought that the secretory hypothesis was really what was going on. Every single one of them, quote unquote, even under the lousiest conditions, would replicate Krogh's findings. And so this is when people really started to pay attention to what this young scientist was doing. He's 38 years old at the time. So with this discovery, it really spawned a new field with a lot of endless questions. And so Krogh actually ended up entering what I call the decade of exercise physiology. So he ends up, of course, designing more tools in order to answer more questions. By designing a magnetic bicycle ergometer and a gas apparatus with the accuracy of 1/1000th%, he began determining how different rates of exercise change oxygen demand. He discovered the concept of oxygen debt. So this is an interesting concept that once you start exercising, you don't actually begin utilizing all of the oxygen that your muscles want. Oxygen is really important for energy metabolism, for aerobic metabolism. That's the definition of aerobic energy metabolism, is metabolism that requires oxygen. So what oxygen is actually doing at the molecular level is serving as, you remember, the final electron acceptor of the electron transport chain inside of the mitochondria. So any energy production or ATP production that requires oxygen happens inside the mitochondria. And this fundamental process is the reason why if you increase ATP demand, you need to suck in and take and use more oxygen to do aerobic energy metabolism, which is more energy efficient than anaerobic energy metabolism. There's some more Nobel Prizes, probably the Corys that I'll get into, probably Otto Warburg that I'll get into, that discusses molecular metabolism in greater detail. So I won't go into that now, but those will be some exciting topics. So I'll just say that when you need more ATP to fuel muscular contraction, you end up demanding more oxygen to be delivered to the skeletal muscle. And that was the fundamental question that Krogh was trying to answer. And oxygen debt is such that once you begin exercising, so you say you go on a run, for the first several seconds, you need more oxygen than you're actually using. And then it takes some time after the blood starts getting delivered to the muscles that your oxygen demand is met by your oxygen supply. And then once you stop exercising, you continue burning more calories. You continue using more oxygen to pay off that oxygen debt. So this was discovered in Krogh's laboratory. This is also known as, in some ways, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC. So this was begun in the early 1910, 1920, by August Krogh. So then he ended up asking, okay, at the molecular level, how is oxygen getting to those muscles? And based on the structural drawings in textbooks at the time, it was assumed that capillaries, like all vessels, just kind of remained open. And so, of course, he realized, well, in order to really thoroughly test this, I need to make more tools. He devised numerous new methods like imaging live tissues and injecting dyes that would actually stick inside open vessels when the animal was sacrificed, so that you could dissect it and look at where the dye is inside your vessels. And then he was able to determine what ended up being his Nobel Prize discovery, the capillary motor mechanism, such that the capillaries do not all remain open all the time, but they're only open when needed. During intense exercise, for example, the muscle generates an oxygen demand, and oxygen delivery is accommodated by opening more capillaries. So, for example, he would have guinea pigs, at rest, and inject the dye, see how many capillaries were open. Then he would have them run at different intensities. And the higher the exercise intensity, the more capillaries would be open. And so the reason this was so interesting is because people thought that, they always remained open. And this shows a new level of adaptability, a new mechanism of adaptability that's ultimately responsible for accommodating an increased demand. So I'll try to give an analogy. So you've all been to a crowded grocery store and you get in line and, say there's 10 cash registers and 5 of them are open at the time. And you're in line and you're just like, man, this is taking forever. Why don't they just open more lanes? Why don't they get someone else to do that? And so in order to accommodate all of this increased demand of customers trying to get through and pay for their merchandise, they should just open up more lanes. And that's exactly what happens. So in order to increase the demand, to accommodate the increased demand of customer flow, they increase more of the available capillaries or more of the available cash registers. And actually, Krogh goes on to study angiogenesis, or the development of new blood vessels, as many other people do. And we know now that this is a really crucial part of the adaptation to aerobic exercise, such that if you, for example, at Costco every Saturday, if a particular location is constantly getting this increased demand at a certain time and pushing that they even overflow maybe those 10 cash registers, they might as well build more cash registers so that they have 12, 13, 14. That's what happens to us. In order to increase more oxygen delivery, because of a regular demand from your exercise, we end up building new capillary networks that can deliver more oxygen to our muscle. So that's actually a really cool concept. It's fundamental to exercise physiology. And so we published these papers in 1918 and 1919. It was a series of several papers, and he won the Nobel Prize in 1920. So that's actually uncharacteristically fast after the publication of a discovery. And then sort of spawns an entirely new part of his career, and I think is an interesting perspective when you take a step back, that he starts dabbling into all these other areas. Right around that time, so 1922, the first patient was treated successfully with insulin. So that's another Nobel Prize, was the discovery and isolation of insulin, that I'll get into. I think that's Frederick Banting. I think that's an interesting one that we'll get into. But Marie and August, so Marie is August's wife, the physician. Marie and August brought back insulin to Denmark from Canada. He succeeded in convincing the proprietor that insulin should be manufactured without profit to private persons. So this is actually a concept that might deserve its own discussion at a certain point, that is related to patenting discoveries, that would be interested to get into at another point. And if anybody knows more about this part of the story, I would love to hear some insight, and I might go into it for the Insulin Nobel Prize. But this also founded Nordisk Insulin Laboratory and Nordisk Insulin Fund, which today is now Novo Nordisk, currently with a market cap of over $365 billion, and has been rated the 23rd most valuable company in the world. So that's a really interesting thing. And so as he gained this fame and started realizing the impact that he was able to do, the Rockefeller Foundation funded a massive expansion of the Krogh Laboratory. He then trained numerous scientists from around the world, especially in the fields of exercise physiology, temperature physiology, and things like that. And just a couple interesting things, kind of more about his career that are not directly related to the science, is that he created a what seems like an original wearable device. So he got into studying heat exchange during exercise, which ultimately led to understanding heat exchange in the home. So how homes and buildings should be operating, and how a human responds to different temperatures. And he created a microclimatograph that consisted of a wristwatch with the clockwork reconstructed so that it can register temperature and humidity on a smoked glass plate. So a pretty sophisticated wrist-worn wearable device to tell you your temperature and humidity. And the final interesting note I think is interesting on, just his perspectives and role in academia. He actually ended up resigning from the Royal Danish Academy. So he had previously been a member of this prestigious community that had elected him to become a member, but he ended up resigning from the Royal Academy because he failed to induce the Academy to take a more active attitude concerning the economic support of science. And another interesting thing is that he refused the deanship of Copenhagen University, not because he didn't like how Copenhagen was funding his people, but it was so that he could focus on teaching and research and did not want to do any administrative work. So now I'll talk about some of the qualities that I think maybe have facilitated his success, some that could probably be extrapolated to other settings. He demonstrated this resourcefulness from a young age. So that's something I think that definitely requires practice and thoughtfulness. How can I create something with as little as possible? If you listen to a founder's podcast, for example, Christopher Nolan, who directed Oppenheimer and Inception, is known to have a similar sort of quality of resourcefulness and building the most with a small amount of material, for example. He also appeared to have great mentorship. So even beginning with William Sorensen, who just told him to go to the lecture of the guy that ended up spawning his excitement for science and quantitative research. So having these mentors, even if it seems like a small role at that time, it looked like it had a lot of influence on Krogh's career. Also, his ability to apply physical knowledge to biological domains. So he did a lot of these sort of engineering feats in order to measure like molecular oxygen, molecular gases, applying these physical concepts to biology. And so that's something that is seen now, this cross-disciplinary research, or in other fields of business, bringing in a novel background that hasn't yet been applied to one field can really yield a lot of new, unique insights. Another thing, and this is more practical, is that he wrote in English rather than Danish. And so he published very few papers in Danish, actually, and he was actually sometimes criticized for that. A Danish scientist should write in his native language, he was told. And Krogh answered that one serves both one's country and science better by writing in a way suited to make one's work known in wider circles. So that's an interesting concept that allowed for the dissemination of his work. And also, just one interesting thing, he was noted to be very hardworking, very industrious. He'd show up and working in the lab very, very early, and cleaning personnel were not allowed to enter the rooms before 9 a.m. He took a 1-hour break from 9 to 10 and then continued as a rule until late in the evening on his work. So maybe it helped that his family members were also in the lab with him. His wife was there, so that must have helped by combining multiple aspects of his life into one. And once an interview asked about his hobby, he answered, "My work." So I think that sums it up well. So in summary, we'll take up some lessons from Krogh. We learned that gas exchange occurs due to diffusion in our capillaries, meaning the way that oxygen gets delivered to our muscles is through diffusion across our capillaries rather than some other obscure signaling or secretory hypothesis or mechanism. In addition, capillaries open and close based on demand and are slightly regulated differently than our arteries. For example, when we go out in the cold weather and our fingers turn blue, our arteries are very constricted, but our capillaries are very widely dilated, and the oxygen extraction that happens at the capillary level is responsible for the blue coloration in our fingers. And I think that, for example, if you want to understand the efficiency of systems, biology is an excellent way to understand the efficiency of systems. I don't think that Costco, when they designed their cash registers, was thinking about August Krogh's Nobel Prize on capillary opening and closing, but it's possible that other systems in the world could learn some new insights about energetic efficiency from molecular metabolism. So just something for people that without the science background, I think this could help. And also one of the biggest lessons that innovation is required for new knowledge. Numerous times throughout his career, if there wasn't a tool that he thought worked well enough, he just built a new one. And that's all for the first episode of Noble Innovation. I'm excited to see how this project develops, and I would love your insight and your feedback. So that's all I have for today. Now go innovate.